Hi, and welcome to the last video of our 7-part series of basic checkmates you must know. In this video, we'll be covering how to checkmate with the king and rook against a lone king. And if you watched the last video, it's a very similar technique to when we had a king and a queen against the lone king. What we want to do is think about this as our rook creating a box that traps in the opponent's king. So the opponent's king only has the squares available inside of this blue box because the rook is cutting off the e-file and the second rank. So every time the opponent's king moves, first take a look at your rook and see, can I shrink the box? And if the rook can't shrink the box, then look to the king to help out. Now there are some cases where you can do shortcuts to this technique. For example, here you might try rook to e3 check, because if the black king goes to the second rank, he's actually going into a smaller box. But for now, let's not worry about that, and let's go with a consistent plan of shrinking the box and keeping the king up towards this corner of the board. So now the king has to either go to the left or up because our rook guards the d-file and the second rank. The box for the black king looks like this. So let's say the king goes up to the fourth rank. Now we don't have rook d3 available because the black king would capture. So that means we should use our king to help cut off the third rank. Now our box looks like this, with the rook cutting off the d-file. And we have most of the third rank cut off except for the a3 square. So let's say the king goes to b4. Here you could do the shortcut by checking on d4 and forcing the king to a smaller box if he escapes. But if you want a straightforward way to play it, it takes a couple more moves. You could start with rook to d3, cutting off the third rank with the rook, still guarding the d-file. In this position, the rook cannot move to the d4 square because he will be captured, and moving to the c3 square allows the black king into a larger box. So in this position, you could make a waiting move with the king. If this king retreats over to the b-file, use our rook to cut off the c-file where that king just came from. You can see now the box is getting even smaller. Rook cannot go to c4 safely, so let's use the king. Again, we don't want rook c4 because the black king will escape our box, and we're not worried about shortcuts, so let's use the king again to make progress. Now we can safely shrink this box with the rook, guarded by our king. You can see the box is getting smaller. And at this point, we don't have rook b4 safely. The black king would capture. So let's use our king to help out. And one thing to think about whenever you see the opponent's king reach the edge of the board, again, we need to watch for stalemates. So before you lock in this move, think ahead in your mind. If I put my king on c5, does the black king still have a square? Our rook guards these two squares, our king guards these two squares. Yes, there's still one square for the black king, so we're good here. Now, we want to keep this king trapped on the edge of the board, similar to when we had king and queen against king. So let's use our rook to cut off the b-file. Now, if we look at the remaining squares for the black king, there's 4 squares available. They're all on the a-file. So the risk of stalemate should be pretty low as long as each move we check to make sure before we let go of our piece that the black king still has a move. So in this position, let's put the black king down to a5, trying to make it difficult for us. Here we do not have the rook check because the black king will escape our box, and we don't have this rook check because the black king will capture. So let's make a waiting move with our king. And the idea is we want to keep marching this rook up the board, trapping the black king, until the black king only has these 2 squares. At that point, we put our king up to c7, and then we're going to try to checkmate on the a-file. So at this point, the black king retreats. We shrink the box. We cannot shrink the box here, so we use the king. This would be a check, allowing the black king to escape, so we use our king again. Shrink the box. Now at this point, we got to be careful. Only 2 squares available for the black king. We need to watch for stalemates. Moving our rook to b7 would be a very bad move because that's stalemate. So in this case, we move our king. We can see here if we had another move, rook to a6 would be a checkmate. So keep that in mind, because here we still want rook to a6, but we don't want the black king to capture. So what we need here is what's called a waiting move. We need to put the rook on a square where we can go to a6 on the next turn. Any of these squares along the 6th rank will work. We can put our rook on any of those squares. The black king will have to move up to a8, and then we can complete the checkmate next. We can see here the rook checks the king. Our king guards these two squares, and it's a checkmate. That concludes the 7th and last part of our series. I hope you enjoy them.